And now, for our final story today. Vladimir Putin is the longest-serving Russian leader since Joseph Stalin. He's been in power for over 2 decades. And we all know that no matter how much the West tries to isolate him, how many sanctions it slaps on Russia, or what conspiracy theories it hatches against him, he remains unfazed. In fact, he seems to thrive in such an environment. So the big question is how? How does Putin remain untouchable? What's the secret of his longevity? Hello, and welcome to this segment. Over the years, Putin has managed to stay one step ahead of his rivals, be it in politics, diplomacy, or even propaganda. He's always had a countermove ready. His critics have tried everything to take him down, attempted assassinations, public protests, defenestration attempts, but nothing has worked. So why are they unable to touch him? Well, for starters, because they don't know his real power base. You see, if you want to fight Vladimir Putin, you need to understand where his support comes from. And here it's not the people. As much as Putin enjoys their support, he cannot claim that the 146 million Russians are backing him unconditionally. There will always be some opposition, some protesters on the streets of Moscow, but Putin knows that these people do not define Russia. They are an insignificant minority, so he does not bother about them. Instead, he focuses on the silent majority, the people who do not like him, but choose to stay quiet rather than speak up. And who are these people? Mostly the intelligentsia, the so-called deep state, the bureaucrats, the security establishment, the oligarchs, the ones who run the country in Putin's absence. Over the years, he has cultivated deep state support by rewarding competence with power. You see, in Russia, only competence counts, not connections or corruption. If you deliver results, you get promoted. That's the policy. And once you rise to the top, you cannot help but become a Putin loyalist because Putin was the one who promoted you. This is one reason why the security establishment is largely pro-Putin. All of them were groomed by him. He brought them to the fore. And since then, they have delivered time and again, whether it was crushing opposition, suppressing protesters on the streets, or eliminating enemies abroad. They have done it all at the behest of Putin. Take the case of Sergei Naryshkin, the head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service. He's widely believed to be Putin's right-hand man when it comes to sensitive operations. First, he played an important role in rigging elections in Putin's favor. Then, he engineered the downfall of Yukos, one of Russia's largest oil companies, which was owned by Putin's rival, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And more recently, he spearheaded the campaign to discredit the opposition leader Alexei Navalny. These are just a few instances from his long career. The point is, these men operate like a shadow government, and they're all Putin loyalists. So taking them on would mean losing control of the state apparatus, which means Putin simply cannot be removed through a palace coup. His detractors also fail to realize that while Putin may not enjoy absolute support at home, he commands undisputed authority in the military. You see, in Russia, the army is separate from the government. It's a world of its own, and for decades it remained weak and directionless. It lacked basic supplies, salaries were delayed, weapons were outdated. But Putin changed all of that. He modernized the military, increased salaries, and made the army Russia's most powerful instrument of state. Today, the soldiers swear by him. They call him Father. Soldiers' wives sport Z tattoos, a symbol of their unconditional support for Putin and his war. So much so that if you're a Russian soldier and you protest against the war, you could face up to 15 years in jail. So you can imagine what would happen to the Russian army if Putin were to lose power. It would collapse like a house of cards. Putin's rivals know this, which is why they do not dare touch him. The Kremlin strongman also wields considerable soft power in Russia. He has carefully cultivated a larger-than-life persona. For Russians, he is a father figure. They look up to him, trust him, almost idolize him. He's a wartime leader who makes them feel proud. To challenge Putin is to challenge this image, to go against their father figure. So, for the average Russian, Voting against Putin is unthinkable, and we saw this during the recent presidential election. Sure, there were reports of fraud and violence, but that's beside the point. The fact is, Putin won the election hands down. He secured 77% of the vote. His closest rival, a communist, got less than 5%. Now, how can an election be so decisive? Because in Russia, only one candidate really matters. The rest are just foils. And even if Putin loses public support, he still controls the levers of power. According to the Constitution, he can remain president for 2 more terms, which means he could stay in power till 2036. But chances are he will not make it that far. More likely is the scenario that he will engineer a smooth transition of power, something like what President Xi Jinping did in China. Xi abolished presidential term limits, yes, but before that, he groomed a successor, Li Qiang, groomed him for years. And when Xi finally stepped down as president, Li Qiang was more than ready. Something similar is happening in Russia. Putin has already identified his successor, none other than Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. He's been grooming him for years, giving him more and more responsibilities. Soon, Shoigu will take over as defense secretary, and once he does, it'll be smooth sailing all the way to the top. So even if Putin loses public support, he will ensure that his chosen one succeeds him, which is why Putin is untouchable. But what if he loses the backing of the elites? Well, let me tell you one thing about Vladimir Putin. He's extremely paranoid about his legacy. He fears losing power, yes, but more than that, he fears being humiliated, being shown the door by the very people who put him there. And he has good reason to fear because in Russia, ousted leaders don't live very long. Think of former President Mikhail Gorbachev. He oversaw the dissolution of the Soviet Union, a feat he thought would earn him global adulation. But soon, he found himself out of favor, sidelined and forgotten. Or consider Boris Yeltsin, the first president of Russia. He left office in disgrace after presiding over a financial crisis. He died a broken man. So what if Putin suffers a similar fate? And here's what worries him the most: the possibility of a so-called velvet coup, a bloodless palace coup where he is forced to resign. If that happens, Putin will become a lame duck president, a symbolic head of state with no real power. And this will be his biggest nightmare because as president, Putin enjoys complete immunity from prosecution. He could be tried for anything. Even if convicted, he would spend the remainder of his life inside the Kremlin walls. So to prevent this, he has a plan in place. Should he be forced to resign, he will declare himself prime minister for life. And given that he handpicked both houses of the Russian parliament, he will easily get the appointment. And as prime minister, he will continue to live in the Kremlin, surrounded by all the luxuries, all the perks of the presidency. Plus, he will remain untouchable, beyond the reach of any court. So, in a sense, Putin has already planned for his post-presidential life. If he loses power, he will keep living in the shadows, pulling the strings from behind the curtain. And this is why no one can touch him, not the West nor the opposition. Vladimir Putin is too smart to be taken down. He always has a countermove ready, and in the game of chess that is geopolitics, only one player truly matters, the one who stays alive to fight another day. That's it for tonight. If you liked this video, press the like button, share it with your friends, and follow us on social media.